celiac dietitian here with over 10 years of living with celiac under my belt. Today I want to talk about a video that came into my feed that was a little upsetting, and I want to correct some of the misinformation in there, and I also want to give you some tools to help you quickly identify misinformation when you're out and about. So I'm not going to waste any time. I'm just going to dive straight into it. So let's do it.
17 patients with celiac disease. When they were given ordinary bread, almost all of them had a major reaction and had a negative alteration in their gut bacteria, so their probiotics. However, when those same people ate sourdough bread, we're talking about celiac, people with celiac, a major gluten sensitivity, 0% of them had a negative reaction, because when you go through a fermentation process, it breaks down the gluten, breaks down the starches when you do a 24-hour fermentation process, and now it's a completely different food and you can digest it well. Hey, let me know in the...
Okay, that's the video. There are first a couple of things I want to correct and note before we dive into the research, because I did find the research study and I'll bring it up and we can talk about that a little bit more. But first, what I want to note is, first thing in the beginning, he says that there were negative alterations to their gut bacteria, their probiotics, and that's not fully accurate. And actually in this research study, they're not talking about gut bacteria. The only thing I can think of that might make him think that is they are specifically talking about probiotics you'll find in food, like lactobacilli, specifically lactobacilli actually. But this is not looking at the gut microbiome at all, the study that he's referencing. It is looking at intestinal permeability, saying, so they're probiotics, which, like, no, that's the incorrect usage. It's microbiome. But also that research study doesn't, like, they're not looking at the impacts of the microbiome when a celiac is consuming bread versus sourdough. They're looking at intestinal permeability. That part's wrong. Then he says we're talking about celiac, a major gluten sensitivity, which is also not really the correct way to describe celiac. It is an autoimmune disease that occurs in response to gluten being in the body. So it's not a major sensitivity. It is an autoimmune disease. So that's also not correct. And I think it's really important to keep those differences separate, because celiac disease is its own completely different condition from non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and the treatments look very different, and it's really important to keep those two things separate. And then the other thing that I do want to bring up before we dive into this research study and I start correcting some of the things he's saying, is that he said, thanks to its 24-hour fermentation process, sourdough bread breaks down gluten and starches and can be more easily digested, even for people with gluten sensitivities, which in the video he specifically said celiac, but even for people with gluten sensitivities. Now, something that you'll notice when people are sharing misinformation is that they'll often have a partial truth kind of embedded in there, or some truths embedded in there that make it more believable, and they're sandwiching the more exaggerated or extravagant or incorrect information in between. So here, it is true that fermented foods can be wonderful and beneficial to the digestive system, because they do break down some of those more difficult to digest carbs and sugars and things like that, that then make it so somebody might not feel like it's harder to digest them. So, for example, someone who has gluten intolerance, which is different from celiac disease, or gluten sensitivity, different from celiac disease, might find that they do better tolerate sourdough because the bacteria has pre-digested, if you will, some of those nutrients in that food. The same goes for people who maybe they are sensitive to, like, other complex sugars. The bacteria can pre-digest and make it easier to process those nutrients. We also know that bacteria can pre-digest foods and make nutrients even more absorbable. So it's a really, I mean, it's a fascinating field of study. It's a these foods can be truly beneficial. But the key here is like, don't eat them if you can't, like if your body is not, like if you cannot tolerate them, or your body is quite literally launching an autoimmune reaction to them and damaging your small intestine. Which he's saying in the study, the people with celiac did not launch an, well, he said that they, you know, had negative gut alterations to their microbiome, but more correctly, they did not have increased intestinal permeability, which is true, and we're about to break that down because he's in a large way, he's misrepresenting the research, because they did find that, but there are a lot of things that are very important to make note of that he left out in this video. So, that's me dissecting that video and giving you some key things to look for when you're trying to identify misinformation in general, but also kind of correcting some of the misinformation he's already sharing in this video. But now I do want to pull up this study. I'm going to try to keep this a little bit interesting because I know studies can be quite dry. I'm going to pull up this study and just pull out some of the more important details that he left out but are really important to make note of. So if we just start with, first thing I'm noting is this was done in 2004. One of the first things I look for when I'm looking at a research study is when did they do this research, because it's just helpful to know, not that it's too old, it could still have some helpful information, but I find it interesting that I've not heard of any more recent studies about this. So first thing I'm looking at, it's from 2004. It's a quite old study. Then I'm reading critically, I'm just critically reading the title of the study, okay? So it says, sourdough bread made from wheat and non-toxic flours. And this could be a little bit confusing, but if you read further down, I believe in the study when they're saying non-toxic flours, they are referring to gluten-free flour. So I think when they say non-toxic, they're meaning it's not going to cause a reaction to the celiac sprue patients. So like here they say non-toxic oat, millet, and buckwheat flours, meaning these are gluten-free flours. They're not going to trigger, or they shouldn't be an issue for intestinal permeability with a celiac disease patient. So, sourdough bread made with wheat and non-toxic flour. So right off the bat, this is not just your typical sourdough that you're going to buy at the grocery store. This is a sourdough made with wheat and gluten-free flours, and we'll learn more about that further on. And started with selected lactobacilli is tolerated in celiac sprue patients. So right off the bat, we know this is not your run-of-the-mill sourdough bread loaf that you're buying at the grocery store and making at home, because it's made with a specific blend of flours, and it's also made with very specific lactobacilli. And we'll read down in this abstract, they basically identified that there were lactobacilli that did a very good job at breaking down gluten. Actually, in the study, they talk about this. So they identified those strains, and they wanted to see if they could use this bacteria to break down gluten in gluten-filled ingredients to create gluten-free food for people with celiac, because in the food industry, they're noticing a lot of people are leaning on just naturally gluten-free ingredients, but wouldn't it be cool if we could just do this and create gluten-free food from gluten-filled food? That's the whole point of the study. The whole point of the study is not to say that if you ferment wheat flour and make sourdough bread, a celiac will be able to tolerate it. That's not the point of the study. The point of the study is they're trying to find a way to create gluten-free food by processing it with bacteria to have the gluten broken down. So that's also something really important to note, because he absolutely took this study in a completely different direction that this study was not meant to be taken in. This wasn't meant to say, again, that people with celiac can eat sourdough. It was meant to say, hey, is this a viable way of breaking down gluten so people with celiac can tolerate these foods? So that said, we know that it includes specific strains of bacteria. We know that the purpose of this is to find a way to process gluten-filled food to make it gluten-free. We also know it's not just specific bacteria that they used, but they also used the bacteria's cytoplasmic extracts, which can help break down gluten as well. And something, if you read the whole study, they note is they had to use extra than what was already provided by the bacteria. So that was also necessary in order to reduce the gluten to a point where people with celiac were not reacting. So keep that in mind. All right. So we're gonna scroll down a little bit more to some more interesting information. If you want to read this whole study, it'll be linked down in the description box below. But I want to scroll down to the discussion part because I think there are some interesting pieces of information there too. All right. So this is where they're talking about identifying lactobacilli strains that had the ability to break down gluten, and that's how they selected them. The last thing that I think is interesting to note is, and he did not clarify this, is that they did try this before with wheat sourdough. And they did notice that the gluten was reduced significantly, but it still had way too much gluten for someone with celiac. And so in this study, they had to mix and they had to decrease the amount of wheat flour to 30% and mix it with gluten-free flour in order to get the results that they got. So this wasn't like, oh, they just like threw I know I already said this, but they didn't just throw regular sourdough bread at people with celiac. They specifically concocted and identified bacteria that could break down gluten, added in cytoplasmic extracts to further break down that gluten, and they had to add in extra than what was produced by the bacteria. And then they also had to use 70% gluten-free flour and 30% wheat flour in order to do this. So those are just like, the way he represented this research was so not just not representative of what the actual findings were. It's extremely frustrating, and it plays into the myth that is already so pervasive in the gluten-free world when we're interacting with outsiders, that people with celiac can tolerate sourdough. If you just ferment the bread, it's totally fine. That's not the case. It's just not and this research study actually proves that in saying, like, they tried this with regular sourdough bread and it just didn't cut it. But this is why it is important to note, and I'm coming out with a video, if I haven't already posted it, about why there is this myth that people with celiac can tolerate gluten in Europe. But this could play a factor into why people say, oh, I don't feel so sick when I eat sourdough, or I feel fine when I eat sourdough. Either A, you have gluten sensitivity or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and you're reacting to the much lower amounts because of the bacterial activity. It's pre-digesting the gluten, and also specifically, like, it's probably not going to do it at the level that the bacteria did in this study, because they're using very specific bacteria and extracts from that bacteria. But that could be why. Or if you have celiac, just because you're not reacting does not mean it's not doing damage, and that's something to keep in mind. But that is the way that he presented this. The reason why it just frustrates me is that it's playing into that myth that has been alive since I was diagnosed with celiac, at least, that people with celiac can tolerate sourdough bread, which is just not true. So if you take anything away from this, first, I hope you get some ways to identify misinformation when it's being presented to you. Second, I hope it kind of helped you be able to get more comfortable with looking at studies and look at studies and see what are they actually telling you, what was the purpose of the study versus what this person is saying. And lastly and finally, I hope you know, if you have celiac disease, you cannot eat sourdough that was made with gluten. That's not on the card in the cards for us currently. So all of that said, if you found this helpful, and you're looking for a celiac dietitian to continue breaking down information like this in a easy to understand way, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I know we talked about, so if we know sourdough bread made with gluten is off the table, but if you need help finding gluten-free food in the United States, I have a wonderful, completely free USA food label reading class that you can take. It's completely free, and it will walk you through how to quickly identify if a food is gluten-free in the United States in 4 simple steps without having to always rely on seeing gluten-free on a food label or being super scared of some of the things that a lot of the label scanners can kind of fearmonger and the internet can fearmonger. So it really helps empower you so that you feel way more comfortable looking at a food label. If you're interested in taking that dietitian-led, I'm the dietitian-led completely free class, It'll be linked down below. Again, I'll walk you through how to use those 4 steps. I'll walk you through the research that we have on gluten-free foods in the United States, and then I'll also do some practice label reading sessions with you. So we'll actually practice using those 4 steps with real food labels. That free class is linked down below. And all of that said, like this video if you found it helpful, and I will see you when I see you.